History remembers Robert E. Lee as the Confederate general whose name became inseparable from both honor and rebellion, duty and defeat. But behind the legend, behind the gray uniform and the solemn portraits, stood a family caught in the shadow of one of America's most complex figures. 7 children bore his name, 7 lives woven through the turbulent rise and fall of the Civil War and the uncertain peace that followed. They were raised under the weight of legacy and loss. Some lived in quiet devotion, others in tragedy or obscurity. And together they formed a portrait not of battlefield glory, but of what it meant to live after history had already chosen its heroes and villains. Each one carried a fragment of their father's values, discipline, restraint, and a haunting sense of duty. Yet each was forced to find meaning in a world forever shaped by his decisions. Tonight we count down from number 7 to number 1, the 7 children of Robert E. Lee, and how their lives reflected and at times defied the legacy of the man who divided a nation. Part 2. Number 7. George Washington Custis Lee. George Washington Custis Lee was born in 1832, the eldest of Robert E. Lees. Lee's 7 children, and the one who carried the full weight of 2 powerful bloodlines. His very name bound him to the 2 great families of Virginia, the Lees and the Custises, and from birth expectations towered above him. He was bright, disciplined, and deeply reserved traits that mirrored his father, but without the same charisma. From a young age, Custis Lee seemed destined for command. He entered West Point at just 17 and quickly proved exceptional. In 1854, he graduated first in his class, exactly as his father had done decades earlier. It was a symbolic passing of the torch, the son achieving perfection in the same institution that had shaped the father's career. For the next several years, Custis served as an engineer in the U.S. Army, designing fortifications and teaching military science. But history, as it would so often for the Lees, offered no escape from bloodlines. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Custis resigned his U.S. Army commission to follow his father into the Confederacy. Yet unlike Robert E. Lee, whose battlefield brilliance became legend, Custis's service was largely administrative. He spent most of the war in Richmond, acting as an aide to President Jefferson Davis and advising on fortifications. Some saw him as overly cautious, others as too intellectual for war. It was not until the final desperate days of the Confederacy that he commanded troops in the defense of Petersburg, where he was captured just days before his father's surrender at Appomattox. After the war, George Custis Lee's life took a quieter turn. In 1871, he succeeded his father as president of Washington College, later renamed Washington and Lee University. Under his leadership, the school stabilized and grew, continuing the Lee family's association with education and public service. But he never married, and those who knew him described a man withdrawn, formal and haunted by history, a scholar weighed down by duty, not passion. In 1913, at 80 years old, George Washington Custis Lee died in Virginia, the last surviving Confederate general of his generation. His death closed a chapter that had begun in privilege and ended in reflection. While his father had commanded armies, Custis commanded silence, a man who lived his entire life within the long, unyielding shadow of Robert E. Lee. Plans. Number 6. Mary Custis Lee. Mary Custis Lee was born in 1835, the eldest daughter of Robert E. Lee and the child who most inherited her father's intellect and her mother's independence. From the beginning, Mary seemed to stand slightly apart from the genteel expectations of Southern womanhood. She was sharp-minded, strong-willed, and had little patience for sentimentality. Her father adored her, often calling her "my steadfast Mary," though even he sometimes found her spirit difficult to contain. During the Civil War, Mary was 26, old enough to understand the collapse of her family's world. When Union troops seized Arlington, the Lee family's ancestral estate, Mary was there with her mother, forced to leave their home under orders from the very government her father had once served. The estate was later transformed into Arlington National Cemetery, an act of political and personal symbolism that would forever link the Lees' family loss to the nation's sacrifice. After the war, Mary's life diverged sharply from that of her siblings. While most of her brothers and sisters married or settled into traditional domestic roles, Mary remained single and increasingly independent. When her father became president of Washington College in Lexington, she accompanied her parents but refused to limit herself to the quiet life of mourning that Southern society expected. After Robert E. Lee's death in 1870 and her mother's in 1873, Mary inherited not only her share of family property, but a measure of freedom unusual for a woman of her era. With that freedom, she chose the world. Over the following decades, Mary Custis Lee became an inveterate traveler. She visited Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, England, Egypt, India, China, Japan, and met figures as varied as Queen Victoria and Pope Leo XIII. She was cosmopolitan, eccentric, and unafraid to defy convention. The newspapers of the day called her the Wandering Lee, sometimes admiringly, sometimes mockingly. In 1902, her independence made headlines again, when at age 67 she was arrested in Alexandria, Virginia for refusing to move to the segregated section of a streetcar. Whether her act was one of civil defiance or simple stubbornness remains debated. But the image of the daughter of Robert E. Lee being detained under Jim Crow law was a striking irony of history. Mary Custis Lee never married and spent much of her later life abroad. She died in 1918 at the age of 83, the last surviving child of Robert E. Lee. Her death symbolized the final fading of the Confederate generation. Yet her life, self-directed, fearless, and curious, proved that even within a family bound by duty, there could exist rebellion of a quieter, nobler kind. Number 5. William Henry Fitzhugh Rooney Lee. William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, known to his family as Rooney, was born in 1837 at Arlington House, the same estate that symbolized his family's lineage and would later become one of America's most sacred grounds. If his elder brother Custis was the scholar and his sister Mary the wanderer, Rooney was the soldier, a man of vigor, humor, and loyalty, who most resembled his father in both stature and temperament. In youth, he was sociable and full of energy, a favorite among his siblings. Robert E. Lee, though strict, took pride in Rooney's physical strength and bravery, once writing that his son had the frame of a warrior and the heart of a gentleman. After studying at Harvard, Rooney joined the U.S. Army, serving with distinction in the 6th Infantry and participating in campaigns in the West. Yet, like so many of his generation, his allegiance would be tested by war and geography. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Rooney resigned his U.S. commission and joined the Confederate cavalry. Under the legendary cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart, he proved a daring and capable officer. His rise was swift. By 1863, he was promoted to Major General commanding cavalry forces under his father's overall leadership. Father and son shared the battlefield, not side by side, but bound by duty and unspoken understanding. That same year, fate struck with cruel precision. During a cavalry clash at Brandy Station, Rooney was wounded and captured while recovering at his wife's family plantation. He spent 8 months as a prisoner of war in Union hands. During his captivity, tragedy deepened. His wife Charlotte died of illness, and their 2 small children soon followed. By the time of his exchange and return to service in 1864, Rooney had lost nearly everything but his name and uniform. After the war, he returned to the ruins of family life and tried to rebuild. In 1867, he remarried Mary Tabb Bowling, with whom he had several children. They settled at the reconstructed White House plantation in Virginia, determined to restore both the land and the Lee family's place in post-war society. Unlike many ex-Confederates, Rooney found a second act in politics. By the 1880s, he was elected to Congress representing Virginia's 8th District as a Democrat, a former Confederate general serving in the same government his father had once fought against. It was a symbol of reconciliation and a quiet irony that would have astonished the world 20 years earlier. William Henry Fitzhugh Lee died in 1891 at the age of 54 while still in office. His funeral drew soldiers, statesmen, and citizens from both north and south, a gathering that suggested time had softened the wounds of the past, even if it had not healed them. Rooney Lee's life traced the arc of his generation from privilege to war, from ruin to renewal. And in his endurance, he carried forward his father's belief that honor once lost could still be rebuilt. Number 4. Anne Carter Lee. Anne Carter Lee was born in June 1839, the second daughter of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Custis. Lee, gentle, vivacious, and deeply kind. She was affectionately called Annie within the family, a nickname that suited her soft-spoken nature and warm humor. Of all the Lee children, she was considered the most tender-hearted, the one who could ease her father's stern moods with laughter or compassion. Robert E. Lee often referred to her as "my gentle Annie," a phrase that would later become both a memory and a lament. Annie's childhood unfolded at Arlington House, surrounded by her siblings and the rhythms of an elite Virginia household. Her early years were filled with education music and the religious devotion instilled by her mother. But her youth coincided with the slow unraveling of the nation. When war erupted in 1861, the family's world, once defined by civility and certainty, began to crumble. Annie, along with her sisters, aided the Confederate cause by knitting socks for soldiers and tending to wounded men in makeshift hospitals. By 1862, the conflict had scattered the Lees across the South. Annie and her sister, Agnes, were sent to stay with family friends in North Carolina for safety. There, amid the chaos of war, she fell gravely ill with typhoid fever. Her mother and sister nursed her day and night, praying for recovery. But after weeks of struggle, Annie died on October 20th, 1862, at just 23 years old. Her final words, whispered to her beloved sister, were a quiet plea, "Where's Agnes?" a reflection of the deep, almost twin-like bond they shared. News of her death reached Robert E. Lee. While he was commanding troops in Virginia. The letter that informed him of Annie's passing broke the composure for which he was famous. He wept openly, writing to his wife that the pain of knowing he would never see his daughter again was agonizing in the extreme. That rare display of emotion revealed how profoundly Annie's death affected him, perhaps more than any other personal loss. Because of the war, the family could not retrieve her body immediately. She was buried on a quiet plantation in North Carolina, and years later, in 1994, her remains were moved to the Lee family crypt in Lexington, Virginia, beside her parents and siblings. Her father's words, written decades earlier, became her true epitaph. "To know that I shall never see her again on earth is agonizing." Anne Carter Lee's short life was defined not by public deeds, but by the love she inspired and the grief she left behind. In her death, she became a symbol of the war's private toll, a reminder that even the most revered names in history carry heartbreak in their quietest corners. Number 3. Eleanor Agnes Lee. Eleanor. Agnes Lee was born in 1841, the fifth child of Robert E. Lee and Mary Custis Lee. Known within the family simply as Agnes, she was the intellectual heart of the Lee household, reflective, disciplined, and profoundly spiritual. Where her sister Annie had been light and laughter, Agnes was stillness and depth. A young woman whose faith and introspection seemed to anchor those around her. Her father, who admired self-control above all virtues, cherished her deeply. From a young age, Agnes displayed a keen mind and a writer's sensitivity. She kept a detailed diary for nearly 5 years, chronicling the daily life of the Lee family at Arlington before the Civil War. Through her writings, historians have glimpsed moments otherwise lost to time, skating parties on the canal, visits from family friends, and the ordinary joys of a family, unaware that history was about to shatter their world. When the war began, Agnes's diary fell silent, replaced by the harsher rhythms of displacement and loss. Agnes and Annie were inseparable, their bond described by relatives as like twin roses on one stem. That closeness made Annie's death in 1862 a wound that never fully healed. In the months that followed, Agnes withdrew from society, her humor dimmed and her letters filled with grief. Around that same time, another heartbreak struck: the execution of Orton Williams, a distant cousin and close family friend, rumored to have been her suitor. Within a single year, Agnes had lost both the sister she adored and the man she may have loved. After the war, she joined her parents and younger sister Mildred in Lexington, Virginia, where her father had accepted the presidency of Washington College. There she devoted herself to caring for her parents and to church work, becoming a quiet pillar of the family. Yet her health, always fragile, began to decline. In 1870, after her father's death, she fell into deep mourning. 3 years later, in 1873, she developed what doctors called an intestinal disorder, likely typhoid or cholera. Too weak to recover, she died on October 15, 1873, exactly 3 years and 3 days after her father's passing. She was just 32 years old. Agnes was buried in the Lee family crypt beside her father, her coffin resting near that of her sister Annie. Her mother, already ill and heartbroken, followed her in death less than a month later. For the Lees, Agnes's death marked the final unraveling of the family's post-war sanctuary. The loss of the daughter who had held their grief together through faith and gentleness. Today, Eleanor Agnes Lee is remembered less as a public figure and more as a chronicler of a vanished world. Through her diary, her poetry, and her quiet devotion, she preserved the human texture of a family often defined only by its patriarch. In the soft, deliberate lines of her writing, the Lees are not soldiers or icons. They are simply a family, fragile and yearning for peace. Number 2. Robert E. Lee, Jr. Robert Edward Lee, Jr. was born on October 27, 1843, the youngest son of the Confederate general and the 6th child in the Lee family. Known affectionately as Rob or Bob within the household, he grew up watching his father's military discipline and his mother's unshakable devotion. Of all the Lee sons, Rob was perhaps the most easygoing, modest, humorous, and approachable, with a warm temperament that balanced the gravity surrounding the family name. But history would thrust him into adulthood far sooner than he imagined. When the Civil War began in 1861, Rob was still a student at the University of Virginia. Like his brothers before him, he soon felt the pull of duty. By 1862, he had enlisted in the Confederate Army, serving as a private in the Rockbridge Artillery, and later as an aide-de-camp to his elder brother, General Rooney Lee. His father initially resisted the idea, reluctant to see yet another of his sons drawn into the conflict. But Rob insisted, declaring that he could not remain idle while Virginia fought for her life. He was just 18 years old when he first rode into battle. Throughout the war, Rob gained a reputation for quiet courage. He fought in some of the fiercest engagements of the conflict, Sharpsburg, Fredericksburg, and Petersburg, and rose to the rank of captain. He was known among his comrades not for bluster or ambition, but for calm resolve under pressure. One story, often retold by veterans, described how he continued to command his artillery battery under relentless fire. His horse shot from beneath him, his uniform singed with powder smoke, yet never losing his composure. When the Confederacy collapsed in 1865, Rob was 21, his youth spent in battlefields rather than classrooms. After the surrender at Appomattox, he returned home with little more than his father's respect and a worn uniform. The Lees, like much of the South, had lost their wealth, property, and status. But Rob, embodying his father's stoicism, turned to rebuilding. He took charge of part of the family's diminished estate and devoted himself to farming at the Roman Coke plantation in King William County, Virginia, and inherited through his mother's Custis lineage. Though quiet and reserved, Rob's post-war life reflected perseverance. He rebuilt his farm with his own hands, laboring beside former slaves, now working for wages, a silent acknowledgement of how the world had changed. He married Charlotte Haxall in 1871, a young woman from a respected Richmond family, but tragedy struck when she died the following year, reportedly from complications after a miscarriage. Years later, in 1894, Rob remarried Juliet Carter and had 2 daughters, whom he named after his mother and sisters, Mary Custis and Anne Carter, preserving the family's history through names rather than monuments. Rob's later years were devoted to writing and preserving his father's memory. In 1904, he published Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee. Lee, a collection of personal correspondence that revealed a gentler, more human side of the man. History often painted as a stoic icon. The book remains one of the most valuable insights into the private world of the Lees, written not by a historian, but by a son who had loved and admired his father. Robert E. Lee. T. Lee Jr. died in 1914 at the age of 70, outliving nearly all his siblings. He was buried beside his parents and sisters in the family crypt in Lexington, Virginia. Through quiet resilience, he transformed a legacy of war into one of remembrance. Of all the Lees, he perhaps came closest to peace, the son who chose cultivation over conquest and memory over myth. Number 1. Mildred Childe Lee. Mildred Childe Lee was born in 1846, the youngest of Robert E. Lee. Lee's 7 children, and the final light of a family already marked by loss and legend. Nicknamed Precious Life by her father, later shortened to simply Life. Mildred arrived 16 years after her eldest brother Custis and brought unexpected joy to parents who were already entering middle age. She grew up in an atmosphere of refinement and learning, surrounded by books, prayer, and the quiet discipline that defined the Lee household. Her father doted on her, calling her his joy and comfort, though he still expected from her the same composure and moral strength demanded of his sons. When the Civil War broke out, Mildred was 15 and away at boarding school in North Carolina. Like her sisters, she was soon drawn into the hardships of wartime Virginia. She returned home to help her mother knitting socks for Confederate soldiers and volunteering in hospitals to tend the wounded. Despite her youth, she carried herself with a sense of responsibility that impressed even the older women in Richmond's high society. Friends recalled her as lively and charming, with a quick wit that often lightened her father's somber moods during visits. As the war dragged on, Mildred experienced both fear and deprivation. When Richmond fell in 1865, she and her mother refused to abandon their home, even as fires raged nearby. That moment, a young girl standing beside her mother amid the ruins of the Confederacy, would shape her forever. When Robert E. Lee later accepted the presidency of Washington College in Lexington, Mildred finally lived with him full-time, becoming his constant companion during his final years. They walked together each evening, sharing stories and reflections. He teased her for her poor handwriting, her love of cats, and her mediocre cooking, but the affection between them was unmistakable. After her father's death in 1870 and her mother's in 1873, Mildred found herself the last unmarried daughter of a fallen general. Though she had suitors, she never married. To me, she once wrote, "He seems a hero, and all other men small in comparison." That devotion, combined with her mother's frail health and her siblings' deaths, drew her into a life of quiet service. She managed the family household, cared for relatives, and preserved her father's correspondence and memorabilia, becoming in effect the guardian of the Lee family legacy. In later years, Mildred found solace in travel and faith. She visited England for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, toured the Mediterranean, and even saw the pyramids of Egypt, fulfilling the wanderlust that her sister Mary had once lived out. Yet her heart remained tethered to Lexington and the memory of her father. "All that I am," she once confided to a friend, "was shaped by the shadow and the light of his presence." Mildred Childe Lee died in March 1905 while visiting New Orleans, likely from complications of a stroke. Her death was widely mourned throughout the South. Flags at Washington and Lee University were lowered to half-staff, and Confederate veterans accompanied her coffin back to Lexington, where she was laid to rest beside her parents and siblings. She had no titles, no great fortune, and no descendants. Yet, among the Lees, Mildred was the keeper of the flame, the daughter who stayed behind to preserve the memory of a family whose name once commanded both devotion and division. In her gentleness and steadfast duty, she became the quiet embodiment of reconciliation itself, bridging the gap between the proud, broken South of her father's generation and a nation learning at last how to heal. The story of Robert E. Lee's 7 children is not a tale of generals or victories, but of endurance, a testament to what becomes of those left behind after history has chosen its icons. Each child bore a different reflection of their father's legacy: Custis, the scholar burdened by intellect; Mary, the independent spirit who defied convention; Rooney, the soldier who turned war into reconciliation; Annie, the heart lost too soon; Agnes, the soul that chronicled their quiet sorrow; Rob, the steady hand who turned conflict into remembrance; and Mildred, the last flame who carried their memory into the new century. Together they formed a family whose story traced the slow transformation of the American South itself, from grandeur to ruin, from defiance to reflection. Through their triumphs and tragedies, they revealed that the legacy of Robert E. Lee was not confined to battlefields or monuments, but lived in the choices of those who bore his name. Some retreated into silence, others rebuilt, and still others sought atonement in learning and service. Each, in a way, wrestled with the question that haunted their father to the end: what is honor when the world has changed? By the time Mildred passed in 1905, the age of the Lees had become history. Yet their lineage, preserved in letters, diaries, and the university that still bears their name, endures as a mirror of a nation's struggle to reconcile its past with its conscience. The Lee children remind us that legacy is never simple. It is both inheritance and burden, light and shadow. And sometimes the truest measure of greatness is not in the glory that is won, but in the grace with which loss is carried.